The royal appearance, it was a bright spring morning at Windsor Castle, one of the oldest and grandest homes of the British royal family. The sun shone softly through the ancient stone arches, and the sound of distant church bells filled the air. The castle courtyard had been polished to perfection, every flag flying high and every step gleaming with royal precision. Crowds began to gather behind the golden gates hours before the royal family was due to appear. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, holding tiny Union Jack flags, and tourists whispered in excitement, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty. The event that morning was meant to be a cheerful one, a charity celebration supporting orphaned children across the United Kingdom. Cameras from the press were already flashing, eager to capture every detail. Inside the castle, the atmosphere was busy but controlled. Servants moved quickly through the halls, adjusting flowers, polishing silver trays, and whispering instructions to each other. Everything had to be perfect because the king and queen were coming out in public together, along with the youngest member of the family, Princess Charlotte. Princess Charlotte, only 9 years old, was full of life that morning. Dressed in a light blue dress and a small white cardigan, she looked like a little angel. Her bright smile filled the room as she twirled once before the mirror, her hair tied neatly with a silk ribbon. "You look beautiful, my dear," said her nanny softly, straightening the ribbon. Charlotte giggled shyly. She was excited to stand beside her grandfather, King Charles, and to wave to the people. In another room, Queen Camilla was preparing too. Her pearl necklace rested perfectly against her cream-colored suit. She looked elegant and confident as always, but something in her eyes hinted at stress. She had been under a lot of pressure lately. Public appearances, royal duties, and endless media attention. She expected the day to go smoothly, but little did she know it would be remembered for something entirely different. At exactly 10 o'clock, the palace gates opened and the royal procession began. The royal guards, dressed in their iconic red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats, stood in 2 perfect lines along the cobblestone path. Their rifles gleamed in the sunlight, and not one of them moved a muscle. The sound of trumpets echoed across the courtyard as the royal family appeared. The king walked first, smiling warmly at the crowd. The cheers grew louder, and camera shutters clicked rapidly. Right beside him walked Queen Camilla, waving gracefully. And just behind them, holding a small bouquet of white daisies, was Princess Charlotte, the picture of innocence and grace. The crowd's reaction to her was immediate. People waved and called her name. "Charlotte, over here. You look lovely, Princess." The little girl turned to wave, her smile growing wider. Her joy was pure, and it spread through the crowd like sunlight breaking through clouds. But as the procession moved forward, something small but noticeable happened. In her excitement, Charlotte stepped a few paces ahead of the queen. It was an innocent mistake, the kind only a child would make. She wasn't running. She was just walking a little too eagerly, her tiny feet following the cheers of the crowd instead of the rhythm of the royal formation. Queen Camilla noticed immediately. Her expression changed. The soft smile she had been wearing faded, and her eyes followed Charlotte sharply. To her, the movement seemed improper. In royal events, every step was planned, every position rehearsed. Appearances mattered more than feelings. She leaned toward one of her attendants and whispered something in a low, irritated voice. The attendant nodded nervously, unsure how to respond. From the crowd's point of view, nothing seemed wrong. The queen was still waving, and the little princess was still smiling. But among those standing close, the air felt slightly colder. The royal guards, of course, noticed everything. They were trained to stay silent and still, but their eyes missed nothing. Among them stood Sergeant Thomas Hale, a decorated guard who had served the royal family for over a decade. His duty was to protect, not to judge. Yet even he felt a strange unease as he saw the queen's disapproving glance toward the young princess. Charlotte soon realized she had gone ahead and slowed down. She turned her bright face toward the queen, offering a shy smile as if to say sorry without words. But Camilla's response was only a stiff nod. The little girl's excitement dimmed slightly, and she moved back in line beside her nanny. The rest of the walk continued in silence. The king, unaware of the small moment that had passed, greeted the charity organizers warmly. The queen maintained her perfect smile for the cameras, but the tension between her and the princess had quietly begun. A small spark that would later turn into something much bigger. As the royal family reached the end of the courtyard, the crowd cheered louder than ever. Flags waved, children shouted, and the air was filled with admiration. To the public eye, everything seemed perfect, a royal morning full of grace and smiles. But beneath the surface, inside the castle walls, something unseen had begun to shift. That morning at Windsor Castle would soon be remembered not for its sunshine or its celebration, but for the moment when a royal child's innocence met the cold expectations of power, and when a soldier, bound by silence, would later decide that doing what was right mattered more than obeying royal rules. A whisper turned sour. After the morning walk through the courtyard, the royal family entered the grand reception hall of Windsor Castle. The event was in full swing, a celebration meant to bring smiles and raise funds for orphaned children. Soft music played from a live orchestra, and the long tables were decorated with bright spring flowers and golden cutlery. Everything looked perfect, but the calm on the outside did not match the quiet tension building within. Princess Charlotte stood beside her grandfather, King Charles, trying her best to follow the formal greetings. The king gently rested his hand on her shoulder whenever she forgot to curtsy or got distracted by the sound of music. "You're doing wonderful, my dear," he whispered kindly. Charlotte smiled. She adored her grandfather. He always made her feel safe, even in the most serious royal settings. But a few steps away, Queen Camilla was not pleased. Her smile remained for the cameras, but her patience was wearing thin. The earlier incident in the courtyard, when Charlotte had stepped ahead of her, still played in her mind. To most people it had been a harmless mistake, but to Camilla it had felt like a breach of order, a reminder that the young princess was already drawing more attention than her. As the event went on, people began approaching the royal family with warm greetings and questions. Many of them, especially the younger guests, wanted to talk to Charlotte. "She's so well-mannered," said one woman from the charity board, "and so confident for her age." The compliments made Charlotte blush and made Camilla's smile tighten. The Queen leaned closer to her lady-in-waiting, Mrs. Parker, and whispered in a low but sharp voice, "Do you see what I mean? The cameras can't keep off her. It's becoming distracting." Mrs. Parker hesitated. "She's only a child, Your Majesty. People just adore her." Camilla's eyes flicked toward her. "That's not the point. She must learn when to behave properly." Her words were quiet, but her tone carried the weight of authority. She looked across the room and saw Charlotte laughing softly with one of the charity children. It was an innocent moment, two children bonding, one royal and one ordinary, but Camilla's expression hardened. In her mind, this wasn't the time for giggles. It was supposed to be a formal event, and she expected Charlotte to act like a young royal, not a playful schoolgirl. Meanwhile, Sergeant Thomas Hale, the royal guard who had noticed everything earlier, stood near the far corner of the hall. His position gave him a clear view of the royal family. He was trained to stand still, silent and invisible. But years of service had made him more than just a soldier. He had become an observer of character. He could read people's emotions even without hearing their words. And right now, he could see the cold energy forming between the Queen and the little princess. Charlotte's laughter faded when she noticed Camilla watching her. The Queen's expression wasn't angry, not yet, but it was enough to make the young girl's heart drop. She quickly stood straighter, holding her bouquet tightly in her hands, her earlier cheer replaced by quiet nervousness. When the speeches began, everyone turned their attention to the stage. King Charles spoke first, thanking the charity workers for their dedication. His words were warm, his tone calm and genuine. The audience listened respectfully, but when it was Camilla's turn, her speech carried a certain sharpness. Her compliments sounded polished but lacked warmth. After her speech, she turned toward Charlotte and whispered something the microphones didn't catch. "Stand still. Don't fidget." Charlotte blinked up at her. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said softly. But the Queen continued, "You must act like a princess, not a child on a playground. The little girl nodded, lowering her eyes. Those standing nearby heard the edge in Camilla's tone and exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't the kind of whisper anyone expected to hear in a public event, especially directed at a young royal. As the applause echoed through the hall, the atmosphere grew heavier. Charlotte stood frozen, her tiny hands clasped in front of her, afraid to move. Even the king seemed to notice her sudden change in mood. He leaned slightly and whispered, "Are you all right, darling?" She nodded, forcing a small smile, but Camilla's whisper had already done its damage. The young princess's sparkle, that innocent joy that charmed everyone, was dimmed. When the formal greetings ended, the royal family moved toward the photo area. The photographers positioned themselves, waiting for that perfect royal image. "Your Majesty, a bit closer, please," one of them said. Camilla stepped forward gracefully. Charlotte followed, but she hesitated, unsure where exactly to stand. "Charlotte, here," Camilla said, pointing to a spot beside her. The child obeyed, standing stiffly. Cameras flashed, dozens of them, capturing every small detail. In the photos that day, the Queen looked proud and elegant. But those who later looked closely noticed the contrast. The Queen's tight smile beside the little princess's uncertain eyes. Sergeant Hale watched from his post, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He had seen discipline before, strict teachers, commanding officers. But something about this moment bothered him deeply. The event was meant to inspire kindness, yet within the royal circle, a child was being quietly scolded for simply being joyful. He kept silent, but deep down he knew this tension was far from over. As the royal family exited the hall, the crowd outside cheered again. The Queen smiled and waved as if nothing had happened, and Charlotte did the same, though her wave was smaller this time, hesitant, almost shy. Inside the castle, whispers had already begun. Staff members exchanged looks, unsure if they had really heard what they thought they did. Even Mrs. Parker looked troubled as she followed the Queen down the hall. And far behind them, Sergeant Hale stood at attention, his thoughts heavy. He had sworn never to speak during royal events, but something told him this situation was different. For now, he remained silent, but soon, a moment would come when silence would no longer be an option. The moment of humiliation. The next day, the royal family attended another public event, a formal ceremony in the royal garden, where officials, diplomats, and families of soldiers were invited. The event was meant to honor those who had served the country, and it was being broadcast live on national television. The morning was calm, but beneath the calmness, tension was quietly growing. Queen Camilla was in a sharp mood. She had slept poorly, and whispers from the palace staff had reached her ears. Whispers about how people noticed her tone toward Princess Charlotte the day before. Though no one dared say it to her face, Camilla felt the judgment around her. She hated it. She was determined to maintain control and restore her image as the graceful, composed Queen Consort. Princess Charlotte, meanwhile, was nervous. Her nanny had told her to just smile and follow the Queen's lead. But the memory of the Queen's harsh words still echoed in her mind. The little girl promised herself she wouldn't make any mistakes today. She wanted to make her family proud, especially her grandfather, King Charles, who always smiled when she did. At 11 sharp, the royal family walked into the garden. The red carpet stretched across the perfectly cut grass. Rows of chairs were filled with soldiers, veterans, and their families. The royal band played softly as the guests stood in respect. Cameras rolled, reporters whispered into their microphones, and every move of the royal family was being watched by thousands. Charlotte walked beside Queen Camilla, her steps small and careful. The Queen's expression was stiff but polite. To the crowd, they looked like a perfect royal pair. One seasoned and elegant, the other young and sweet. No one could see the invisible wall between them. When they reached the stage, the ceremony began. The king gave a warm speech, praising the courage of the soldiers and the importance of family values. The audience clapped. Then Queen Camilla was invited to present medals to the children of fallen soldiers. It was a touching moment, one that demanded grace and empathy. "Your Majesty, would you like Princess Charlotte to assist?" asked one of the event organizers kindly. It was a simple question meant as a suggestion, but it caught Camilla off guard. The cameras turned toward her, waiting for her response. She forced a smile. "Yes, of course," she said, though her voice carried a hint of irritation. Charlotte's eyes lit up. She loved helping, and she wanted to do it perfectly. As the first child approached the stage, Charlotte handed the medal gently to Camilla, who then placed it on the child's chest. The crowd smiled and applauded the sweet teamwork between them. For a while, everything went smoothly, until the fifth medal. As Charlotte reached for the medal tray, one of the ribbons slipped from her small fingers and fell to the ground. It was a tiny accident, the kind any child might make. But the sound of the medal hitting the wooden stage echoed louder than it should have. The Queen's smile froze. The cameras were still rolling. People in the audience exchanged glances, unsure what had happened. Charlotte, startled, bent down quickly to pick it up, whispering, "I'm sorry." Camilla leaned toward her, her whisper sharp as a blade. "Be careful. You're embarrassing yourself. And me." Charlotte froze, her little hands trembling as she held out the medal again. Her eyes shimmered, trying to hold back tears. The microphone on the Queen's collar barely picked up the words, but those standing near the stage heard it clearly. The event continued, but the warmth had vanished. The Queen's tone had cut through the air like cold steel. The King looked uneasy but said nothing. The soldiers in the front row exchanged sympathetic glances toward the little princess, who was now visibly nervous, her eyes fixed on the floor. Among the guards surrounding the stage was Sergeant Thomas Hale, the same guard who had been present the previous day. From his position near the left wing, he saw everything. The princess's small hands shaking, the Queen's glare, the audience's uncomfortable silence. His jaw tightened. Every instinct in him screamed to stay silent. Protocol demanded it. But the soldier in him, the man who had once comforted crying children in war-torn villages, couldn't ignore what he saw. Then came the breaking point. After the ceremony, as the royal family turned to wave at the audience, Charlotte tried to smile for the cameras. But Camilla, without realizing a microphone was still live, leaned down and hissed under her breath. "Next time, stay behind me unless you're told otherwise." It was meant to be private. It wasn't. The microphone caught the words faintly but clearly enough for the crowd nearby to hear. A hush fell over the front rows. Even the band seemed to miss a note. Charlotte's face turned pale. Her lower lip trembled. Sergeant Hale's hand twitched against his rifle. His heart pounded. Breaking protocol was a punishable offense, a career-ending one. But seeing a child humiliated in front of hundreds was too much for him to bear. He stepped forward slightly, breaking formation by half a step. It was subtle, but in royal ceremony standards it was bold. His eyes met Charlotte's for a brief second, a silent gesture of reassurance. She blinked up at him, her eyes glistening. The King noticed the tension but chose to ignore it, keeping the ceremony moving. The Queen, unaware of how clearly her words had carried, continued to wave with her fixed smile. But by the end of that day, whispers had already reached the media. Reporters caught the faint audio clip. "Did Queen Camilla scold Princess Charlotte?" one journalist asked in disbelief. The video replayed across social media within hours. Public opinion began to stir. And while the world buzzed with questions inside the palace walls, Sergeant Hale stood silently at his post that evening, knowing the moment would come when he would have to make a choice between his duty and his conscience. The guard's breaking point that evening, Windsor Castle was unusually quiet. The event in the royal garden had ended hours ago, but its shadow still lingered within the palace walls. The staff moved silently through the marble corridors, whispering in low tones about what had happened. The faint audio clip of Queen Camilla's harsh whisper had already reached a few journalists. Though the palace's media team worked fast to control the story, tension inside the castle was undeniable. Sergeant Thomas Hale stood in the guards' quarters, still in uniform, his tall black hat resting on the wooden table beside him. The glow from a single lamp cast long shadows across the room. He stared at his reflection in the small mirror, the face of a man torn between his oath and his conscience. For more than 10 years, he had served the royal family faithfully. He had endured rain, cold, and exhaustion without complaint. His duty was simple: obey orders, protect the royals, and never, ever interfere. But that rule had started to crumble inside him the moment he saw Princess Charlotte's face. He couldn't get the image out of his mind. Her trembling hands, the tiny medal dropping to the floor, the Queen's sharp words. It wasn't anger he felt. It was something deeper, a sense of moral duty. He had served under commanders who taught him that honor meant more than silence. As he stood there, the door opened quietly. It was Corporal Evans, one of his closest comrades. "Tom, you all right?" Evans asked, lowering his voice. Hale nodded, though his face told another story. "You heard what they're saying?" Evans continued. "Press is already buzzing. They caught the Queen's words on a hot mic. Palace is panicking." Hale sighed. "I heard." Evans leaned against the wall. "Just don't say anything, mate. Let the palace deal with it. You know what happens if you get involved." Hale didn't answer. He simply stared out the window, watching the rain begin to fall over the courtyard. Later that night, as the rain turned into a soft drizzle, Hale took his post outside the south gate. The castle lights glowed against the wet cobblestones, and the sound of distant thunder rolled through the sky. Inside the courtyard, the royal family had gathered for a private dinner. Through the grand windows, he could see faint silhouettes. The king seated at the head of the table, the Queen beside him, and Princess Charlotte across from them. Even from afar, Hale could sense the unease. The princess sat silently, her little hands folded neatly on the table. Occasionally she looked down, avoiding eye contact with the Queen. The king tried to lighten the mood, his voice soft and kind, but the tension was thick. The servants who entered and exited the dining room exchanged glances, whispering to each other in the hall. Halfway through dinner, the Queen's voice could be faintly heard, sharper than before. She was speaking to the princess again, her tone stern. Hale's posture stiffened instinctively. He couldn't hear every word, but the fragments carried through the open window with the wind. "You must understand your place. Not everything is about you." He saw Charlotte's small frame shift, her shoulders tightening. She nodded quietly, though her lips trembled. The king gently said something, but Camilla waved her hand dismissively. The dinner continued, but the mood only worsened. Hale felt something inside him snap, not in anger, but in quiet conviction. A soldier's instinct told him when to step forward and when to stand down. Tonight, his instincts told him that silence was no longer an act of respect. It was an act of cowardice. He had once sworn to defend the royal family, not their titles but their humanity. And now, the youngest among them needed defending more than ever. When the dinner ended, the Queen exited first, escorted by attendants. The king remained behind for a private talk with one of his advisors. Princess Charlotte walked slowly through the corridor with her nanny, her little steps echoing softly on the marble floor. She looked tired, her eyes red from holding back tears. At the end of the hallway, they passed the south gate, where Sergeant Hale stood motionless. Charlotte looked up for a brief moment and met his eyes. Her lips curled into a small, sad smile, the kind of smile that said, "I'm fine," even when she wasn't. And that was it. "The breaking point, Your Highness," Hale said before he could stop himself. His voice was soft but firm. The nanny froze instantly, startled that a guard had spoken, a violation of royal protocol. Charlotte turned, surprised. "Yes?" she whispered shyly. Hale lowered his head slightly. "You've done nothing wrong, Princess. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The nanny's eyes widened. "Sergeant," she began, but Hale continued gently. "You've got your grandfather's heart. That's something no crown can teach." For a moment the world seemed to pause. The rain outside had stopped. Charlotte blinked, her eyes glistening. Then, with a small, trembling voice, she said, "Thank you." The Queen's voice suddenly echoed from the corridor behind them. "Charlotte, where are you?" The princess quickly turned and hurried away with her nanny, but not before giving Hale one last grateful look. When the Queen appeared moments later, her gaze landed on Hale. Her expression was icy. "Did you speak to her?" she demanded. Hale didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Majesty." "I did. You're aware that's against protocol?" "Yes, ma'am." His tone was respectful but steady. The Queen's jaw tightened. "Report to your superior in the morning. You'll answer for this." "Yes, ma'am," Hale replied calmly. She glared for a moment longer before walking away. But for the first time that evening, Hale didn't feel fear. He felt peace. That night, when he returned to his quarters, the rain had stopped and a quiet stillness filled the air. He knew his career might be over by morning, but deep down, he also knew he had done the right thing. For years, he had protected the royal image. Tonight, he had protected something more important: a child's heart. As he removed his gloves and placed them beside his hat, a faint knock came at the door. It was a messenger holding a sealed note. Hale opened it carefully. Inside was a small folded card in neat handwriting. "Thank you for speaking up, Charlotte." A single tear slipped down his cheek, and for the first time in his long, disciplined career, Sergeant Thomas Hale allowed himself to smile. Silence. Across the courtyard, morning sunlight spilled gently across Windsor Castle, painting the cobblestones gold. Birds fluttered in the distance, and the sound of footsteps echoed softly through the courtyard. It looked peaceful, but for those inside the air was heavy, the calm before a storm. Sergeant Thomas Hale had reported early for duty as ordered. His uniform was spotless, his hat polished to perfection, but his mind was not at ease. He stood outside the commander's office, waiting to be summoned. Every passing second felt slower than the last. He knew what was coming: punishment, maybe dismissal, for speaking directly to a member of the royal family, especially the princess. But strangely, he wasn't afraid. He felt something stronger than fear, a quiet certainty that what he had done was right. Inside the palace, whispers spread like wildfire. The Queen had reported his disrespectful conduct to the head of royal security, yet not everyone agreed with her. Many staff members had seen the Queen's behavior toward Princess Charlotte. Some quietly admired Hale for his courage, even if they couldn't say it aloud. At the far end of the castle, Princess Charlotte sat in her room by the window, looking out at the courtyard below. Her nanny brushed her hair gently, but the little girl's eyes were fixed on one figure, a red-coated guard standing alone by the gate. She recognized him instantly. It was Sergeant Hale. She didn't understand all the rules of the royal world, why kindness had to be hidden behind silence. But she knew one thing: that man had stood up for her when no one else did. Down below, Hale adjusted his gloves and stared straight ahead, pretending not to notice the faint figure watching him from the window above. But he knew she was there. Somehow he could feel it. The heavy oak door to the commander's office finally opened. "Sergeant Hale," a voice called. He stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with the scent of polished wood and old books. Colonel Whitmore, his superior, sat behind the desk. His face was calm but unreadable. "Sergeant," the colonel began, folding his hands, "I've received a formal complaint from Her Majesty the Queen. She claims you breached royal protocol by speaking directly to the princess without authorization." "Is that true?" "Yes, sir," Hale replied, standing tall. "Did you in any way act with disrespect?" "No, sir. I spoke kindly. The princess appeared upset and I offered reassurance." The colonel exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "You do realize how serious this is? The Queen demands a disciplinary review." "Yes, sir." Whitmore looked up at him with a strange mix of frustration and admiration. "You've been one of my best men for years, Hale. Loyal, brave. You've guarded the king himself. And now you've risked your entire career for a child's tears." Hale's voice was steady. "Sir, with all respect, we serve to protect, not to watch cruelty in silence." The colonel's eyes softened for a moment. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. "You've got more honor than most men in this castle, Sergeant. But the Queen's word carries weight. I'll try to handle this quietly. You're suspended for now. Wait for further notice." Hale saluted sharply. "Understood, sir." He turned and left the room. The door closed behind him, with a soft thud that echoed down the long corridor. Outside, the castle courtyard had grown busier. Horses clopped along the stone path, and servants hurried across the square. Yet somehow it all felt muted, as if the world had lost its sound. The guards stood at their posts, silent as statues, their faces unreadable. When Hale stepped outside, a few guards glanced his way but quickly looked forward again. No one dared speak, but their eyes told him everything. Quiet respect, hidden beneath duty. Then came the moment that would be remembered by everyone who saw it. The royal family appeared at the top of the courtyard steps. King Charles walked first, his face thoughtful, followed by Queen Camilla, whose expression was cold and proud. And beside them was Princess Charlotte, holding her small white handbag, her head bowed slightly. As the royal procession moved forward, the guards snapped into perfect formation. The air grew still. Hale stood in the front row, motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. When they passed by him, the Queen's gaze flicked toward him, a look of silent triumph. But then something unexpected happened. Princess Charlotte slowed her steps. She turned her head slightly and looked directly at Sergeant Hale. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The crowd, the cameras, even the birds, everything fell into a deep hush. Then, breaking every expectation of royal behavior, the young princess lifted her hand and gave a small, gentle wave, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but to him. The gesture was simple, but in that silence, it spoke louder than words. The Queen noticed and stiffened instantly. Her expression tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Charlotte!" she hissed under her breath. But the king, noticing the exchange, smiled faintly, just enough to let the princess know he approved. For the first time, Hale felt the weight in his chest ease. He gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, in acknowledgement of her gesture. It was a soldier's promise. "I'm still here." The procession continued, and soon the royal family disappeared through the grand gates, leaving behind the sound of applause and the whisper of a story that would not stay hidden for long. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the castle towers, the courtyard fell silent again. The guards changed shifts and the torches were lit one by one. Hale stood at his post for what might be his last time, watching the glow fade into twilight. He thought of the princess's smile, the king's quiet understanding, and the courage it had taken to simply speak the truth. Sometimes, breaking silence was the loudest act of loyalty. As the wind rustled through the flags above, a soft voice broke the stillness behind him. "Sergeant Hale?" He turned, and there, standing shyly beside the gate, was Princess Charlotte, escorted by her nanny. She looked up at him with grateful eyes. Before he could speak, she said quietly, "Grandpa says brave people don't always wear crowns." Hale's throat tightened. "Your grandfather is a wise man, Your Highness." Charlotte smiled, that same innocent smile from days ago, and whispered, "Thank you for helping me." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Hale standing beneath the royal crest, tears glistening in his eyes as the night closed in around him. And through that silence across the courtyard, one truth rang clear: kindness once spoken never truly disappears. Aftermath and reflection days passed, but the walls of Windsor Castle could not contain the story. The quiet whispers of what happened between Queen Camilla, Princess Charlotte, and Sergeant Thomas Hale began to spread far beyond the palace gates. At first, it was only small talk among servants and royal staff. Then it reached reporters, who picked up fragments. A royal guard breaking protocol, a confrontation, an emotional moment in the courtyard. The palace press office tried to control the rumors, but it was too late. The public's curiosity had already turned into a storm. The media stormed by midweek. Headlines started appearing across the internet. Royal Guard defends Princess Charlotte. Palace silent. Witnesses say guard spoke up against Queen's harsh words. Queen Camilla's public image under fire. After Windsor incident, though the palace neither confirmed nor denied the reports, the silence only fueled the public's interest. Talk shows discussed it. Social media exploded with opinions, and people across the country debated the same question. Had a royal guard really broken centuries of silence to protect a child? Inside the palace, tension thickened. The Queen grew restless, insisting that disciplinary action be taken immediately. "He humiliated the crown," she said sharply in a private meeting. "If guards start talking, we lose control." But King Charles was quiet, listening with furrowed brows. Finally he spoke, his tone calm but firm. "Camilla, perhaps the humiliation was not his doing," he said softly. "Perhaps it was our own." The room fell silent. The Queen turned away, her lips pressed tight. The guard's fate, meanwhile, Sergeant Thomas Hale, remained suspended from duty. His red uniform hung in his quarters, perfectly pressed, untouched since that day. He spent his mornings walking the castle grounds as a civilian, his mind restless yet at peace. For him, the outcome didn't matter. He had spoken the truth. But one cold morning, an unexpected message arrived. A royal messenger knocked on his door and handed him a sealed envelope bearing the king's personal insignia. Inside was a single note. "Report to my study at 10 a.m., King Charles." Hale felt his heartbeat quicken. He dressed neatly in his formal uniform and made his way through the long corridors he once guarded. Every step echoed with memories, the endless hours of stillness, the moments of duty, and that single instant when he chose compassion over silence. When he entered the king's study, Charles was standing by the window, hands behind his back. "Sergeant Hale," the king began, turning toward him. "You've caused quite a stir." "Yes, Your Majesty," Hale said quietly. The king studied him for a moment, not with anger but with something closer to respect. "You spoke out when others stayed silent. That takes courage. You may have broken protocol, but you did not break honor." Hale stood at attention, unsure what to say. The king continued, "Charlotte told me what you said to her, about doing no wrong. It comforted her. You gave my granddaughter something even I couldn't give in that moment. Protection that came from the heart." Hale's throat tightened. "It was my duty, sir. Not as a god, but as a man." The king nodded slowly. "And that's exactly why the palace needs men like you." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air was still, the only sound coming from the ticking clock on the wall. Then finally the king stepped forward and extended his hand. "Your suspension is lifted. You'll resume duty, and with my personal commendation." Hale's eyes widened slightly. He bowed deeply. "Thank you, Your Majesty. However," the king added with a faint smile, "I'd prefer you try not to start another national scandal." For the first time in days, Hale allowed himself a small laugh, the Queen's reflection in her private quarters. Queen Camilla sat by the window, reading the morning papers. The headlines were still relentless. She closed the newspaper slowly, her reflection caught in the glass before her. For once she looked tired, not from public duties, but from the weight of self-awareness. A part of her had always believed she could maintain control, that royal order was more important than emotion. But now, seeing how one guard's act of kindness had inspired millions, she felt something shift deep within. When she next saw Princess Charlotte, the child greeted her politely as always. But there was a quiet distance between them, a small wall built not from rebellion, but from hurt. The Queen bent down and placed a hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "You did very well at the garden ceremony," she said softly. Charlotte looked up, surprised. "Thank you, ma'am." For a moment their eyes met, and in that fragile silence, Camilla realized that power meant nothing without compassion. A new beginning. Weeks later, the royal family appeared again in public. The same courtyard, the same red uniforms, the same golden sunlight. The crowd cheered as always, but this time something was different. The atmosphere felt warmer, lighter. Standing in his post, Sergeant Hale watched as the royal family approached. Princess Charlotte, holding her grandfather's hand, looked radiant and confident again. When she spotted Hale in the formation, she smiled, the same bright, innocent smile that had once melted the tension in the courtyard. And though he didn't move or speak, Hale felt the message clearly between them, a quiet bond that needed no words. The Queen followed behind, her usual sternness softened. For the first time, when she passed Hale, she gave a small nod, subtle but meaningful. The reflection. That night, as the castle lights glimmered in the river below, Hale stood alone by the courtyard gate. The world had gone quiet again, but this silence felt different, peaceful, not heavy. He thought about everything that had happened, a child's courage, a queen's pride, a king's wisdom, and a moment of truth that had changed them all. He realized that sometimes history isn't written in battles or speeches. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, and the bravery of one person who refuses to let kindness be silenced. As the moonlight fell across the castle stones, Hale whispered softly to himself, "Protocol can bind the body, but never the heart." And with that, he turned toward the castle gates, standing tall, proud, and calm, a silent guardian of not just the crown, but of human decency itself.